So today's story is a very creepy one. In fact, it's so unsettling at times that you're very likely going to think it's just fake. But there was a pretty incredible discovery that was made in the early 1900s that very likely means this story is true. But before we get into that incredible campfire story, as you can see, I'm literally sitting by a campfire. And honestly, it was just because, what I sort of do is I tell scary campfire stories a lot of the times. But I never actually sit by a fire. And so we decided, why not literally make a campfire and tell a spooky story by it? And if this vibe is something you guys like, I'm more than happy to do more of these because this sort of breaks it up. It's cool. It sort of adds a new flavor to the channel. And so let us know if you enjoy this vibe and we'll do more. And I think that generally speaking, when we do literal campfire stories, I'm going to lean towards the stories that are of the spookier variety. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But don't tell them you've secretly put firecrackers in their marshmallows. Okay, let's get into today's story. Hundreds of years ago, there was this young indigenous warrior who was on his way to the center of his village. And his village was located in this heavily forested rolling hills area of modern-day Richland County, Wisconsin. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was this indigenous tribe, and that's where they called home. And as this young warrior, this strong, brave young man is walking towards the village center, he had been called there by his tribal chief. He sort of had an idea of why he was being called there. And sure enough, when he got to the village center and he sees his tribal chief, who's standing there with 9 of the other strongest and bravest men of the tribe, this warrior knew, his hunch was correct. So 2 days earlier, 3 teenage boys that were members of this tribe, they had gone out deer hunting in the wilds right outside of their village. Again, this is a heavily forested, beautiful rolling hills area. And these teenagers had not come back. They had just been gone now for 48 hours. And their respective families were worried. And they had been, telling the tribal chief that they really needed to send out a search party for them. But the chief had sort of held off, in part because it wasn't entirely uncommon for hunters, even young hunters, to go out for a couple of days at a time. But the family, they had a bad feeling about it. And so finally, the tribal chief relented 2 days in, and he was calling a search party together to go look for these young men. And so the warrior who's walked into the village center here, he was being asked by the tribal chief to lead this search party effort. He was going to be in charge of these 9 other men. And so, the warrior, in truth, he sort of felt like it was overkill to put together this huge search party for these teenagers that in his mind, he really did think they were just fine, but he didn't want to undermine the tribal chief. And so he said, of course, I'll go do it. And so the warrior, along with the 9 other, strong, brave members of the tribe, they gather up some weapons and some food and water because they didn't know how long the search was going to take. They said goodbye to the members of the village, and then they exited the village in the same direction that basically all the hunters would go when they would go on hunting expeditions. There was like sort of a well-worn path that led out into the wilds of the forest. And so the warrior, who's again leading this search party, he was a skilled hunter himself. And as he's walking along this well-worn trail, he quickly found the tracks of these teenage boys. So they identified the tracks. And, right away, the warrior's thinking, this is going to be, no big deal. We're going to follow these tracks. We're going to find the kids. They probably are out camping somewhere. We'll give them a stern talking to and bring them back home, and that'll be that. But, as they're following the tracks along the well-worn trail, eventually the tracks, they deviate and they leave the trail and they start kind of veering off into not really uncharted territory, but certainly areas that were not necessarily known for good hunting. This tribe they were prolific hunters, and so they knew this area extremely well, and they really had the designated areas that were the best. And so already they're seeing that these boys, they're doing something different, or they're doing something that's not advantageous for hunting. But either way, they're following these tracks that are going for miles and miles just into the wild. And also, as they're moving along here, they start to notice that there's no point at which the boys stopped. There's no, tracks that indicated they came to a stop and rested, or, stood still and tried to kill a deer or something. It was like they were just on a mission, hiking deep into the wilds. And so, the warrior's keeping a lot of these insights to himself, and he's just following the tracks. But after hours of this, when they still have not found the boys, they eventually found themselves at the top of this ravine. And as they're looking down into it, they realize that they've gone so far, not only away from their village, but so far off, the beaten paths that they were familiar with from all their hunting, that they knew this was an area that they really had never been to before, and they had no idea, what was down in the ravine or what was beyond. I mean, this is sort of uncharted territory for the warrior and the search party. But what they did know is that the tracks of these teenage boys continued down into this ravine, and so down the ravine they went. And then when they got to the bottom of this steep ravine, the trees kind of cleared out a little bit, and right in front of them, where the tracks continued, is this opening to a cave. And it's so dark inside that they really have no sense of how far back it goes or anything, but they see the tracks that they're following of the teenagers lead into that cave. But there are no tracks coming back out again. And so, presumably, the teenage boys, for reasons totally unknown, have hiked all the way out here, have gone into that cave, and that's where they are. But again, from the outside, the warrior and the others, they can't see these teenagers. And so naturally, the group, they walk up to the mouth of the cave, and even up close, it's starting to get a little bit dark outside, but there's still some daylight. Even up close, they can't see very far into the cave. It's just very dark. I mean, it's clearly big enough inside that you could walk for a great distance, or a pretty decent distance, but at some point it must sort of bend off and go in a different direction, and they can't see the teenagers inside of there. And so the warrior at this point, has a level of apprehension here, because he doesn't know this cave. He doesn't know this area. He doesn't know what's happened to these teenagers. He doesn't know if they're okay or not in there. He doesn't know if there's a predator or something inside of this cave. And so what he does is he decides, okay, I'm going to send 2 of my men of the search party in there to scout this out, and the rest of us will stay out here and just wait. And so he designates the 2 who say, okay, and they go into the cave. And so the warrior and the 7 other men that he's with are just standing outside of the cave, and they're listening intently, because these 2 men that are going in, they're calling out the names of the missing teenagers. They're yelling, and all they can hear from the outside is just the sound of the 2 men yelling. They're not hearing any response from the teenagers. It's just quiet inside of the cave. And again, from the warrior and the other search party members' perspective, they can only see the 2 men that have gone in for a little while, and then they kind of disappear into the darkness, but they can still kind of hear them. And so they're calling out for the boys' names, they're calling and calling. And then around the same time that the warrior and the others he was with lost sight of the 2 men that went in looking for the boys, at the same time that they lost sight of them, they stopped making noise. It's like the cave went completely silent. And so for about 5 minutes or so, the warrior and the others, they're just kind of anxiously waiting, what's going on in there? But it's completely silent. 10 minutes goes by, and then 15, and it is dead silence. There's nothing coming out of the cave. It's just eerily quiet. And so the warrior at this point, he tells the others to stay put, and he just steps a little ways into the cave, just enough that, he was sort of inside the entrance of the cave. And he began calling out the name of the 2 men who went in. Now they're missing as well. He's calling their names out. As he's yelling their names, it's sort of echoing through what appears to be a vast cave system. But there's no response. at least not at first. If there had been no response, it would have told him at least, okay, maybe they're hurt or they're too far away, I can't hear them. But instead, he did get a sort of response, but he couldn't make any sense of it. He heard what sounded like a wailing sound coming from deep inside of this cave, way, way deep inside, this wail that at first it sounded like one voice, and then it sounded like multiple voices kind of layered on top of each other. And then, with this sudden realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a cry. He was hearing a chant. And it was a very particular chant, very particular to the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was the chant that warriors did before they died. It was literally known as the death song. And as soon as the main warrior is hearing the death song being chanted deep inside of this cave, the other men he's with, these 7 others who know exactly what that song is, they all sprung forward and said, what do? We have to go in. There's something wrong. And before the lead warrior could tell them what to do, 6 of the other men just charged into the cave, chasing down their brothers because they believe they're about to die. They would never be singing that song, chanting that song, if they weren't in real danger. And so the lead warrior and the one other guy that stayed back, they stayed put, just kind of waiting to see what would happen. And they're listening to these 6 others, go running into the cave, and they disappear into the darkness, and they're yelling over and over again for their brothers. And they can still hear that chanting, that death song reverberating off the walls. But then suddenly the cave goes silent again. The chanting stops. All the calling from the 6 men that went in, that stopped too. It's silent again. And it's just the lead warrior still in the mouth of the cave next to the one guy. Now they're scared. And they're just listening for anything, but it's just completely quiet. And then, before the lead warrior or the other guy could do anything, that rhythmic chanting began again, the death song. But now it was clearly far more than just a couple of voices. It was this rhythmic, loud, multiple voices layered on top of each other deep inside of this cave, chanting the death song over and over again. At this point, the lead warrior and the other, he had a decision to make. Deep down, he knew it was his responsibility, his moral responsibility here. It was code to go in there, and if you have to, sacrifice yourself to get these guys out of there. But he also thought, logically, something bad is happening inside of this cave, and if me and the other go in there right now, we're not coming out again, and no one's going to know what happened. There will be no saving. Everyone's just going to perish. And so even though it sort of went against every fiber in his body, the lead warrior, as this death song is reverberating off the walls, he and the other, they turned and they ran miles and miles all the way back to their village. And by the time they got there, it was dark out, and they, breathlessly told the tribal chief what had happened. And he said, tomorrow, first thing in the morning, first light, we're going to go back to that cave and we're going to get those boys out of there. And so sure enough, the next morning at first light, the tribal chief, the lead warrior, and the other man that he was with, the 2 that had come running back from the cave, they, along with about 100 other members of this village, they banded together and out into the wild they went, retracing these steps all the way back to the cave. And when they got there, the cave was still, it was quiet, there was still light outside, but there was no sign that anybody had come back out of the cave. All the tracks that went into the cave still had not come back out again. So they believe at this point, still, their loved ones are in this cave. They don't know what's happened to them, but they're in there and they have to figure out what's going on. Now at this point, the lead warrior didn't really know what the plan was. I mean, he remembered what happened the day before, and really anybody who went into the cave was seemingly swallowed whole. And so he didn't really have a sense of how they were going to do this. But the tribal chief, he spoke up and he said, I have a plan. We're not going to break up into groups and go into this cave onesie-twosie and see what happens. We're going to go as one big group. We're going to lock hands in one big line so that we're always connected. Never let go of the person's hands that are left and right of you. And the lead warrior and the other man, they're going to lead us into the cave in the direction of where they heard their brothers when they went in there. And we're all going to trail, and as one, we're going to walk into this cave until we find our missing people, and we're going to get them out of there. And so the lead warrior thought this was actually a brilliant idea. You know, we'll all be together. We'll be holding on to each other. Nothing can happen to us this way. And so the lead warrior was second in line. The man who was leading the line was basically the other guy he was with, the two that had run back. He was the other guy. So he's in front. The lead warrior is second. He's locked hands with this guy. And then behind him is basically about 100 other people, all, holding on to each other's hands. One big line. And when they were ready, the lead warrior and the man in front of him, they began moving into this cave. And so into the cave they went. And as they're walking, they can tell pretty quickly that the cave, it sort of turns to the right. You have to walk in, maybe 50 or so feet into the cave, but then it sharp rights. And so there's enough light coming in that you can basically walk all the way up to that turn. But then when the lead warrior and the man in front of him made that sharp right and they began walking that way, it was utterly pitch black. No light reached that section of the tunnel. But, they're leading the line, and so they're still just moving along, and the whole line's following them pretty slowly. And as they're walking, the lead warrior, it's like he kept trying to blink his eyes to just try to capture anything, but he can't see anything. It is pitch black, and he's just gripping onto the men in front and behind him as tight as he can to show solidarity, like we're here together, we're going to be okay. And as they're walking, the lead guy kept calling out the names of the many men at this point that were lost in this cave, but there's no response. And as they're walking and shuffling along, again, they can't see anything. The walls are getting tight. They hear from somewhere deep in the cave the death song. The chant begins low and slow, and it begins to build and gets louder and louder and louder. And at this point, because they're all locked together, you can't really get out very quickly. They're well into the cave at this point. They can't see anything, and it's like the walls are echoing, and it's booming in their chest, this chant that's only done when you're on the brink of death. And so as they're walking along, the lead warrior, he's trying to grip as hard as he can to the man in front and behind him, showing them, keep going, it's going to be okay. But then he felt the hand of the man in front of him, the line leader, go slack. And before he could grab it again, the man's hand was out of his. And he's reaching out in front of him, and he can't see him, but he can't feel him either. It was like he vanished. And so now the lead warrior, he's the front of the line. He has no idea what's going on. And he wants to just stop and turn and leave. It's getting so overwhelming. And he's about to do that, but he just feels like there's this force pulling him deeper into the cave. And then before he can do anything else, he opens his mouth and he begins to chant the death song. At the same time this is happening, deep inside of this cave, the tribal chief, along with a couple of others who had not joined the line, they were still outside of the cave. They've heard something going on in the cave, but it's dull. They can't really hear too much. There's something going on, but there's 100 people walking into the cave. They presumed there'd be noise. But suddenly, there was this obvious commotion, panic, erupting from deep inside of the cave. And before he knew it, all these people are coming running out of the cave, scared to death. They come bombing out of the cave. And at this point, the tribal chief knows something horrible's happened. And so he rounds everybody up. He does a head count and realizes over a dozen people are gone. They did not come back out again. And the cave that minutes ago was full of this death song and chaos and panic is silent once again. At this point, the tribal chief sort of designated that it must be the case that there's something evil inside of this cave. There's an evil spirit. There's something in this cave that is taking our people and they're vanishing. They're being swallowed whole by this cave. It's evil. And so from that moment, he forbid anyone from the tribe of ever stepping foot in this cave again. We cannot lose anyone else. Our best bet is to go back to the village and hope that these men, these brave warriors, eventually find their way out again. And so the tribal chief and the rest of these devastated villagers, back to the village they went. And over the next couple of days and weeks, no one came out of that cave. And as weeks turned into months, it's like the villagers, they couldn't really move on, because they were not able to collect their loved ones' bodies or get any sort of closure. It's just this unbelievable mystery, this terrifying mystery that had ripped the entire tribe apart. And so eventually, after months and months had passed, and still no one has any idea what's happened, no one's come out of that cave, the tribal chief finally just said, we are going to basically board up the cave. We're going to cover it with rocks. Effectively, it is now a tomb, and that'll be that. No one will ever go back in. This cave will never claim another life. And so that's what they did. They used huge boulders, and they completely blocked the entrance, and that was it. Now, that was the story that the Ho-Chunk Nation passed down for generations about what happened to all those people, the warriors and the teenagers and all these people, that they were swallowed alive by this cave. And over many years, I mean, many members of this tribe, that heard the story, they didn't know what to make of it. Is it real? Is it just folklore? We don't know. But then in 1930, so hundreds of years later, a chilling discovery was made. So in 1930, there was this guy named Paul Seifert, who in Richland County, Wisconsin, he was sort of a well-known antique dealer. And something he really liked to do was he would go hiking in the forests of Richland County, the rolling hills, and he would look for indigenous artifacts that were left behind from, like the Ho-Chunk Nation and other indigenous tribes that were in the area. Sometimes he'd find, an arrowhead or something on the ground, or pottery or whatever it was. But he liked hiking, he liked being out in nature, and this was something he would look for. And, if he found something good enough, he could sell it in his antique shop. And so he's out walking the hills of Richland County, and he's well off the trail. He's sort of out in the sticks, and he finds this ravine. And he walks down the ravine, and it comes to this clearing of sorts. And he notices on the other side of the ravine, the slope that goes back up, he saw what looked to be almost like a memorial or something, like a stack of rocks that looked sort of out of place. And there was like moss and grass that had sort of grown over it. But he immediately identified that there's a mound of something here that looks a little bit out of place. And so he walks over and he begins sort of pulling off some of the rocks. And he realizes pretty quickly that this was put here on purpose, this pile of rocks, these boulders and all this was put here on purpose. And so after pulling off enough of these rocks, he realizes that there is a cave on the other side. Now, it would take quite a bit of work to pull off enough rocks that he could actually get himself inside of this cave, but eventually he did. And once he was inside of this cave, the same cave the Ho-Chunk Nation had dealt with hundreds of years earlier, he's like, wow, like this cave, it's been blocked off. I wonder what's inside of here. Maybe there are incredible indigenous artifacts inside of here. And so feeling really motivated to explore this cave, he left, went back, got some basic supplies, including a lantern, and then he came back another day, because this is well off the beaten path. No one's going to stumble upon this. And into the cave he went. And so he's in this cave, and he walks, all the way to the end where it banks to the right. He turns, and he starts walking. And the ceiling of this cave begins to come down, and it's getting really tight on him, but he's so excited to see what's in here because he knows this has been blocked off on purpose. There's something in here. And so eventually the ceiling gets so low that he's crawling with his lantern, and right as he's thinking, this is so narrow, I don't know if I can fit, he pulls himself under this one really low section, and everything just opens up. It's like this grand cathedral in the middle of this cave. And he holds out his light. He kind of stands up and he holds out his light. And it's just this massive, massive space. And right away, he sees something on the ground. There are all these neat rows of human skeletons. And they're all positioned the same way. It's like they're kneeling with their hands over their head, like they're bowing. All of them. You couldn't even count how many skeletons are all positioned here, right in the middle of this cavern. And so he's looking at all of these bodies, and he's gasping. He can't believe it. And he brings the light sort of in the direction that all these bodies are aiming towards, all the bodies are praying towards. And carved into the rock is this enormous chair, like a throne. And there was nothing on the throne. And Paul, when he saw that and all these bodies and just the fact that he's deep inside of this cave, he was spooked. Even though there could have been a sea of artifacts he could have taken, he just turned and he bolted. He crawled out of there and he left the cave as fast as he could. And the reason we know about this story is because Paul, after this experience, he got in touch with a local newspaper. It's called the Milwaukee Journal. And he spoke to a journalist about what he saw. And they reported it. They reported that he found these skeletons in this throne, and it's inside of this cave that was blocked off. And, there's allusions to the story of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's like this totally cryptic story. But in 1930, and even still today, we're left with a couple of distinct questions. One, what happened to all these people? And two, who or what was sitting on that throne? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. All right, so I am back in front of a literal fire because you guys loved the last fire episode that we did, the last campfire episode. And on today's campfire episode, I have a great ghost story. Not only is the story itself super creepy, but I'm telling you, the plot twist at the very end, worth sticking around for. You gotta listen. It's a great story. I know you're gonna love it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right fire pit because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to join you at a nice, cozy campfire. But as soon as they sit down and they get their s'mores all ready to go, pull out a fire extinguisher and put out the fire. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One afternoon in the winter of 2015, a 57-year-old woman named Patricia Dare was sleeping on her couch inside of her home in France when the sound of her phone dinging woke her up. Patricia slowly opened her eyes and she felt groggy and confused. She'd been relaxing and watching a movie since she had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, but she realized, she must have dozed off. And so Patricia, she grabbed her phone and she checked her notifications and she saw she had a text message, but from a number that she didn't recognize. And what it said was really weird. It said, quote, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And for a second, Patricia just had no idea what this meant. Couldn't make sense of what this even said. But then she realized there was actually text messages that she had received earlier from this number, and she realized who it was. So the person texting Patricia this strange message was this middle-aged woman named Béranger. About 8 months earlier, Béranger had approached Patricia while she was out in public and told her that she desperately needed Patricia's help. Because, Béranger said, she worked in a castle and that castle was haunted. So Patricia, in addition to being a local news reporter, was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium, meaning she basically believed that she had the ability to contact the dead. That was something she was really passionate about. And in fact, she was fairly famous for being a psychic medium in France. So, this request was actually not that bizarre for Patricia. But because of Patricia's status, both because she was, a famous medium and also because she was on the news, she was sort of well known and it drew a lot of people to her claiming that they had, paranormal issues ranging from, thinking they saw a ghost to their house is haunted or whatever. And almost all the time when Patricia would follow up with some people who claimed they had issues, she would discover that, despite her best efforts, there clearly was nothing going on that was paranormal. There was no dead to talk to. It was just like, drafty windows or a house settling or, just a shadow that looked really eerie or something. So the vast majority of times people approached Patricia, she really didn't take them that seriously. So a couple of months ago, when Béranger had approached Patricia, her reaction to it was basically like, "Oh, your castle's haunted." Yeah, I bet, but she was polite about it, but realistically, she didn't believe it was true. But because Béranger was sort of persistent, really demanding help from Patricia, Patricia did give her her phone number sort of to be polite. And then immediately afterwards, Béranger had texted Patricia And those were the text messages that Patricia had, in the thread, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them. But now, here was Béranger texting her once again with this sort of weird cryptic message, again about this haunting of her castle. And this actually kind of piqued Patricia's interest. And because Patricia did have a day off here, she actually felt inspired to follow up and maybe go check out this castle and see what this haunting was all about. An hour and a half later, Patricia pulled up in front of this small cottage that was on the same property as the castle. She knew from earlier text messages that this cottage was where Béranger actually lived. And so Patricia parked, she got out, she walked up to the front door of the cottage, and she knocked. But nobody answered. And so after a few moments, she tried knocking again, this time a little bit louder, and then the door did open. But it was not Béranger. It was this man, this middle-aged man who looked very confused to be seeing Patricia standing there. And just from the look on his face, Patricia immediately launched into this, explanation of why she was here. Oh, is Béranger here? I was speaking to her via text message. And the man still, he's looking at her like, what are you doing here? What's going on? But then from behind him, out walks Béranger. And when she looked towards the door and she saw Patricia standing there, Béranger was practically weeping. I mean, she was so happy and clearly relieved to see Patricia, and she's just like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming. This is unbelievable. Thank you. Like, we really need your help. And then before Patricia could ask any questions, Béranger pointed to the man that had opened the door for Patricia and seemed so confused. And, at this point, his expression had softened quite a bit. And Béranger said, this is my husband. This is Remy. And he, too, is so relieved you're here. And so at this point, Patricia, she shook his hand and she smiled at them both and was like, yeah, I don't know what I can do for you. Why don't you fill me in? All I know is apparently your castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story? And so Béranger, she had to kind of compose herself because she was quite emotional just to see Patricia here. But, after collecting herself, she told Patricia that about a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the caretaker of that castle, and that she had just come along to help. And she said, at first, both of them had been really excited for this opportunity because it came with free housing in this cottage. However, Béranger said that they had only been working here for a couple of weeks when really weird stuff started to happen. Béranger said that she'd be in the castle doing, daily chores, and she would know that she's the only one in the castle. Yet she would suddenly hear what were obvious footsteps of people walking and running around on the upper floors of the castle. And at this point, Remy chimed in and he said, yeah, me too. Like, I've heard those footsteps in the castle when I know it's totally empty. But even stranger than that is Remy said he'd be in the castle and he would hear voices. And not just, people whispering or something like you see in the movies. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs, like in other distant parts of the castle that he couldn't see. And it was terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Béranger tell this story, Patricia was struck by how earnestly they came across. I mean, they definitely were shaken by whatever they experienced inside of that castle. Like, they were genuinely troubled and didn't know what to do about it. I mean, Remy still had this job at the castle. They still had to go in there. But it was becoming like this big issue and they didn't know what to do about it. As Patricia was listening to the couple tell this story, she couldn't help but feel like they were being very honest. They seemed very earnest as they're telling the story. Like, they weren't trying to dramatize. They were trying to relay what amounted to, trauma. They both clearly did not like going in the castle. It was like this thing they had to do due to Remy's job, but they were trapped. They felt like, we don't know what to do here and no one's taking us seriously. But at the same time, Patricia is a veteran, psychic medium, and she's been to numerous house calls, numerous haunted homes. And, many times, the screams people think they hear in their home are like, the sound of wind coming in through an open window, and the footsteps are like, a pet somewhere in the house. So there could easily be, a reasonable justification here. But it seemed apparent that there was enough here that it certainly warranted Patricia actually going to the castle and having a look around. And so she said, okay, let's go over. Let's go see the castle. A few minutes later, Patricia followed Béranger and Remy along this wooded path from the cottage over to the castle. Even from pretty far away, the castle was huge and very intimidating. There were two very tall round towers on either end, and in the middle was a slightly shorter section that was decorated with a bunch of turrets. The castle only had 2 windows that were visible from the front where they were approaching. And for a second, as Patricia was looking at it, she had this sort of uneasy feeling that the windows were the eyes on the castle and the castle was looking at her. But she shook the feeling off and kept walking along. And a few minutes later, they reached the castle's huge front door. And at this point, Remy pulled out this huge key ring covered in keys, and he unlocked the door, and then he kind of stepped aside and pushed it open, sort of gesturing for Patricia to make her way inside. Now, Patricia was doing her best to be very professional and, not quite buy into the hype, at least not yet. This could be something completely rational, but when Patricia walked into the castle, she found herself inside of this huge empty space called the Great Hall. And the first thing she noticed was really how dark and cold it was inside. I mean, this was a castle, of course, and so that was sort of the atmosphere you'd expect, but this felt like eerie. Like this was not a place you'd want to spend a lot of time. And also, it just felt like the atmosphere was just heavy somehow. Like it really was just a tense place to be. Patricia took a deep breath and kind of centered herself. And then she looked around a bit more closely, and she saw there were a few windows on the back wall, but they were all shut. And then right in front of her was this huge stone staircase. And to her right and to her left, she could see there were long hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of rooms potentially. And so after standing there for a few moments, just kind of taking in the scene, Patricia turned to Béranger and she asked her, she said, okay, so you've heard footsteps, upstairs when this place was empty. Can you tell me what you were doing, in any of the instances where those sounds came through? Like, what were you doing? Do you remember? And Béranger said, actually, yeah, I do remember. The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on the window. And I know I heard people upstairs when I was doing that. And so immediately, Patricia's thinking, oh, that could be it. Maybe it was literally the sound the shutters were making that maybe somehow gave Béranger the impression that there were footsteps elsewhere inside of this castle. I mean, everything echoes inside of here. It's this big cavernous space. It was possible. And so Patricia's like, okay, well, let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if maybe that is causing some strange sounds in your home. And Béranger and Remy did not seem remotely offended by this. If anything, they were eager to find a rational explanation for whatever it was they were experiencing. And so quickly, they, along with Patricia, walked over to one of the windows, and Patricia reached out and she opened up the shutters and then shut the shutters and then did it a few more times. But there were no strange sounds. There certainly were no sounds of footsteps running around inside of the castle. There was no way that the shutters were making sounds that you could confuse for footsteps. This was not it. However, Patricia decided she would, just in case, try another shutter. See if maybe one of the other shutters made strange sounds, just to confirm really this is not the case. But as she reached for this other shutter, before she even touched it, there was this loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound that echoed all through the castle from upstairs, and then it just went deadly silent. And immediately the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood up. I mean, this was like an unmistakable sound. And Patricia, she turns to Remy and Béranger, and they're obviously spooked. I mean, they've experienced stuff like this, but this is still just so terrifying. And Patricia, she's standing there not even sure what to do, but then she tells herself, wait a minute. That couldn't have been what we thought it was. There's no way that was some screech coming from some ghost upstairs. There has to be a logical explanation here. And part of the reason she was thinking this is even in, her time as a psychic medium, nothing this visceral had ever happened in her career. Something like that was out of a movie, literally a ghost screeching upstairs. And so Patricia turns to the couple and she's like, look, obviously I heard that too, but let's not rule out that could have been the wind or something. Let's not jump to conclusions here, okay? Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic, let's just search the castle and see what we're up against. So the couple, Remy and Béranger, they did not seem reassured, but they kind of nodded along whatever you say. But then, before anyone could do anything else, there was another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream coming from somewhere else upstairs. A different voice is now screaming upstairs. And then it went deadly silent again, and then it was very clear to Patricia, and certainly to the couple, that this castle might just be haunted. There's something going on here that is not right. However, as Patricia is standing there kind of trying to get her bearings of like what she should even suggest they do, because suddenly she is like the expert in charge of the response here, before she could even think, she had this very powerful feeling come over her that she would sort of describe as like a pull. It was like a magnet was pulling her in the direction of these screams. Like she felt like she needed to go upstairs to the second floor to wherever those screams came from. She had to. And it wasn't even clear if this was like her channeling her psychic medium powers. It was like the castle was pulling her deeper and deeper inside of the structure. And so without even telling Remy and Béranger what she was doing, Patricia just kind of silently turned and began walking almost against her will towards that stone staircase that went up to the upper levels. And now at this point, the castle is deadly silent. All you can hear is the sound of their footsteps as they're making their way over towards the staircase. And, Remy and Béranger, they're so frightened. They're just, tucked up right behind Patricia, following her along, not even sure what they should be doing. And so upstairs they went, and Patricia, again, she's got like this intense feeling that she has to go upstairs. She can't even control it. And so up the stairs she goes. No one's talking. All they hear is the sound of the footsteps on the staircase. And up they go, all the way up to the third floor, which is, where these screams were likely coming from. And at that point, Patricia, almost on instinct, turned left and began walking down this long hallway with all these doors that were shut along the way. And again, the castle is just deadly quiet. All you can hear are their footsteps. And down the hallway they go, all the way to a dead end where there is a single room that is shut at the very end of the hallway. And at this point, Patricia, almost like without even thinking, she turns and kind of almost aggressively says to Remy, "Get your keys out and open this door." Like she didn't even know why she was being aggressive. It was like just coming through her. But Béranger at this point, she chimes in and says, the owner of the castle, they told us this is the one room we're not allowed to go in. We've never been inside of here. We can't go in here. Patricia, she just looks at Béranger and says, "I don't care. We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." And so at this point, Béranger, she looks at her husband, and Remy kind of shrugged. I mean, they didn't even know what they're supposed to do at this point, but they figured, all right, she's the expert. Let's let her go in. And so Remy, he pulled out his big set of keys and he fumbled through them all. And Patricia, she's rearing to go in this room. She can't even understand why she feels this way. And Remy, he reaches over, he turns the lock, he pushes the door open, and Patricia walks inside. Now, as soon as this door opened up, Remy and Béranger got a look inside of this room. And it was unremarkable. It was like a vacant room. There was nothing inside of it. Like there was no clear reason why this room was off limits per the owner. But as they watched Patricia walk to the middle of the room sort of slowly and methodically and come to a stop right in the middle with her back to them, they could have sworn they heard whispers suddenly picking up inside of this room, even though there's nobody else in there but Patricia. And then Patricia, who by this point was sort of, freaking out Béranger and Remy, she was acting just very different than when she had first arrived. She just stood there in this sort of bizarre way, just like rigid, staring towards the back of this room as these whispers are kind of going on in this dark room. And then from the threshold, Béranger and Remy watched as Patricia, who has not turned around yet or anything, she just began to twitch, like her shoulders were moving around funny and her neck was snapping in a strange direction. And then she began letting out this just awful croaking sound, this constant, like single tone croaking sound. And it went on for so long that you'd think she would have need to take in a breath to then continue this croaking sound, but she didn't. It just went on and on and on, just emanating from her body. And, Remy and Béranger, they're terrified at this point for a host of reasons, but really it's now Patricia that's scaring them the most. And Patricia, as she's twitching and croaking, she suddenly stops and whips around and looks at the couple, and her mouth is open, like her jaw is slack, and this croaking sound is still coming out of her, but clearly she's also weeping. Tears are coming down her face. Now, Remy and Béranger, they are beyond terrified at this point for so many reasons, but they clearly know some kind of crisis is unfolding with Patricia, and they want to help her, and they were about to ask her, what can we do? What's going on? When there's this loud slamming sound somewhere else in the castle on one of the lower levels. It sounded like a door slamming shut, but really loud.
And it was like the noise like snapped Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. And suddenly she became really focused. And then instead of communicating with the couple, she just bolted right past them, sprinted down the hallway, and ran down the stairs. Like she was chasing after the sound that had just been made somewhere downstairs. And so Remy and Béranger, they're like, what else can we do but follow her? And so they run down the hallway, several, lengths behind Patricia, who's somewhere downstairs. And they get down to the second floor, the couple does, and they can hear the sound of movement in one of the rooms down the hallway. And then they hear this loud, like animalistic yelling sound that appears to be, Patricia yelling or growling or something somewhere in one of these rooms. And so they make their way in that direction, and they see there's this open door that leads into a bedroom, and then there's a bathroom off the bedroom. They go in and they look in that bathroom, and there's Patricia, and her back is to them, and she's on her knees, and she's visibly weeping, and she's looking up at something in the room. She was kind of at an angle where they could see her face, and her face is contorted just in horror, and she's seeing something in the bathroom that is just completely terrifying her, but there's nothing in the bathroom. And so Remy and Béranger, they walk in there and they grab Patricia, who did not want to leave, but they drag her out of the bathroom, they stand her up, and they literally forcibly remove her from the castle. Several hours later, Béranger and Remy were back inside of their cottage, sitting in their living room with all these papers scattered in front of them on their coffee table. And next to them was Patricia, who by this point, she was basically back to normal, but she was still very shaken up by what happened in the castle. And also by this point, she was able to explain to the couple what had happened, from her perspective in the castle. She basically told them that she did basically, go into a trance. She had a psychic medium experience, but she had never had anything like this before. I mean, this was visceral. This was way beyond anything she had ever experienced in her entire career. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked room on the third floor of the castle, the forbidden room, the room was not empty. When she went in there, she had that calling to go in there. And as soon as the door opened, what she saw was a room filled with people, with basically entities, ghosts, if you will. Béranger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. And she said all these entities were wearing different clothes, like from different time periods. There were people in medieval peasant outfits, and there were people wearing Victorian dresses, and there were people wearing, very modern 20th century business suits. But that really wasn't the initial impression that Patricia got. That was just something she noticed. What she immediately picked up on when she was called into that room and saw these entities is how lost and sort of scared these ghosts seemed, like they were in trouble. And Patricia, she said, she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then felt kind of anchored there. And as she stood there, these ghosts basically began crowding in on her, like they were trying to get her help by getting closer to her. But she felt like overcome with this almost claustrophobic feeling of being suffocated by their sadness, not even by their physical presence. It was like their loneliness and desperation was like washing over her. And it was so awful. It made her weep. And then eventually, Patricia said she was able to kind of force her body to whip around and look at least in the direction of the exit because she wanted to leave at this point. And it was at that point that, she's making this groaning sound, which she didn't even recall. And she hears this loud slamming sound, which was the door slamming downstairs. And that kind of spooked the entities away from her, and she was able to bolt from the room. And Patricia said when she got out into the hallway and basically began maneuvering in the direction of the slammed door, because again, she had this intense sense of being pulled in the direction of this noise, she said it felt very different than when she had been pulled up to the third floor. She said now, in retrospect, when she had been pulled up there, what she was being pulled by didn't seem malevolent. It seemed, neutral or maybe even positive. But as soon as she was going in the direction of this slammed door down on the second floor, she said it felt totally different. There was obviously like a dark presence, like something bad was pulling her towards them. But still, almost against her will, she ran down the hallway, she went down the stairs, and she made her way into that bedroom, with Béranger and Remy following closely behind. And Patricia said she eventually turned and went into this bathroom in this bedroom. And when she went in there, she saw something that was so terrifying, she just fell to her knees and began to scream. That was that like animalistic wailing sound that the couple heard. What she saw was this enormous, tall, just like dark figure. It was a ghost of this tall man of sorts with like these deep scars all over his face. And he was wearing this rusted chainmail armor, like he was from a different time. And he just seemed evil, like a dark, dark presence. And she knew that was the feeling she was getting. It was coming from this ghost. And it was only because Remy and Béranger came in and basically pulled her away that she thinks she even survived. Like she was being pulled to her death. Like that's the way it felt. But again, fortunately, she's pulled out of the castle. They go back to the cottage. Patricia, had her chance to calm down. And now the three of them were trying to basically decipher what just happened. Like what can we take from this unbelievable story that Patricia has told us and what they witnessed? And what they quickly settled on was, we have a lot that we can begin to explore here, but let's focus on that evil entity, that tall man in the rusted chainmail armor. Who was that? And what did he want? So she and Remy, in the hours since they had escaped the castle, had gathered up a bunch of their historical documents about the castle and laid them out on the coffee table, and they had begun going through them to try to learn about this guy. And at some point, as they were looking through all these documents, there was one particular section that, for whatever reason, just drew, Patricia's attention. She just thought, I want to look at that. And it was the section about a knight whose name was Jean, who had lived in the 14th century. And the document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, which was a conflict between England and France that had started in the mid-1300s. And during that war, the castle was used as a French military fortress, and Jean was killed during a battle at the castle. And so after Patricia read this out loud to Béranger and Remy, Patricia said she just had this feeling that the evil spirit, the tall man in the armor she saw in the bathroom that scared her so much, she had a feeling that, she didn't know why, but that seemed like Jean. However, even if Patricia had been right that this evil spirit she encountered was Jean, they still didn't know, why he was there, or why he had appeared, and why he had called her to the room, or why any of this stuff had happened. The whole thing really was unexplained here. Or, who were the other ghosts who were up on the third floor, that apparently Patricia saw? None of it made any more sense. At some point, Béranger asked Patricia, what do you think? What does all this mean? Why did this happen? What do you think? But Patricia, she really was still very shaken up by this. She was this, renowned psychic medium, but again, she had never had an experience like this. This was really terrifying. And she just was like, look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about this. I need to process what's happened here. And so, obviously Remy and Béranger, they couldn't really protest, but they also were like, man, I really don't want to be left here alone with this horrifying castle, but, you do what you got to do. And Patricia, she got up and she left. After Patricia left, Béranger and Remy both agreed that, despite the fact that Remy was the groundskeeper here and did need to look after the castle, that for now, it was just too dangerous to go in there. It was not worth it. And so they would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could get to the bottom of this. And for a couple of days, with Remy and Béranger staying away from the castle, they had normal lives. Nothing strange happened at all. They just basically lived in their cottage and went about their lives, sort of keeping the castle over here. But after a couple of days, when still Patricia had not come back again, she was still at her home, still processing this whole thing, Béranger started having this weird feeling in her chest. It was like this need to go to the castle, not dissimilar from how Patricia had described this overwhelming sense of being pulled up to the third floor when she was describing her whole encounter, her whole experience. Béranger, she tried to act like this wasn't happening to her, but she couldn't deny it. It's like she just had this feeling of, I gotta go to the castle, I gotta go over there. And then one day, Remy looked out the window of the cottage and he sees his wife, Béranger, walking right towards the front door of this castle. And he's thinking, there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed not to go in. What is she doing? And he literally ran over there and grabbed her and pulled her back. before she went into the castle, which is exactly what she was going to do. And then when she was pulled away, she couldn't even describe why she was over there. She's like, I don't even know. I just felt like I had to come over here. I can't explain it. But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened over these few days after the incident with Patricia. Because shortly after, Béranger almost walked back into the castle, a man had come on the castle grounds. This random man sort of wandered on to the castle grounds and was apparently being drawn, although he kind of framed it differently. He didn't really know why he was there, but he was drawn towards the castle. And as he's walking towards this castle, a deer presumably was also being drawn to the castle, and the deer went running towards the castle and actually rammed into this man and hurt him badly enough he had to be hospitalized. He actually lost an eye from being hit by this deer. And so after this happened, even though, Béranger and Remy were trying to respect Patricia, sort of giving herself some space here, because she hadn't come back, she hadn't been in touch, at this point they were like, we have to get in touch with her. Like, she's the only other person who understands how serious this is. And so Béranger called Patricia and she said, whatever's going on in the castle, whatever dark energy is existing in there, it's getting stronger. Now, at first, Patricia was not inclined to come back. I mean, there was a reason she had not been in touch with them since she had left. She had basically decided, I don't want this in my life. This is terrifying. I don't know what happened, but I don't want this in my life. But she could just tell that, Béranger and Remy, they were at their wits' end here and they didn't know what to do. They were lost and they were turning to Patricia more like a friend, like, hey, please come back here and support us and help us get through this. And so Patricia did agree to go back. And so sure enough, the following evening, Béranger, Remy, and Patricia were back inside the castle in the second floor bathroom where Patricia had been found at the end of that horrible experience, looking up at what she believes now was Jean's ghost, this terrifying entity. And so they're in this bathroom, and Patricia had come in here in order to basically attempt an exorcism. And so she's standing in this bathroom, and sort of behind her is Béranger and Remy, and they're kind of holding each other, and Béranger is so scared she's shaking, and they're watching as Patricia, despite her own fears, she was very calm, and she was standing there with her eyes shut, and she was sort of trying to channel Jean's energy, because she didn't have that feeling being pulled, in any direction inside the castle. She was sort of choosing to channel whatever spirit was inside of this bathroom. And then at some point, Patricia appeared to sort of connect with something in the room, something that, Béranger and Remy couldn't see. The room appeared to be empty to them. But it was obvious that Patricia had sort of picked up on something, and then kind of out of nowhere, she said in this very stern, very loud voice, "Jean, show yourself." And then Béranger and Remy, they're staring at Patricia, because again, there's nothing else they can see in this room. And Patricia, she opens her eyes, and she kind of looks around the room, and then she focuses on something on the other side of the bathroom. Like she can clearly see something, like she's seeing another entity or something. Béranger and Remy are looking, and there's nothing they can see. And then Patricia, again, still very focused, eyes locked on whatever it is in the room, she says again in that stern, loud voice, "It's over. You have to move on." Like she's instructing, this entity, presumably Jean's entity, that he needs to go. He needs to move on. And for a second, it's just silent in the bathroom as Béranger and Remy kind of wait to see what's going to happen. Like, is Patricia going to go into another trance here? Like, what's going to happen? But Patricia, she seemed very calm, very forceful, and she's staring still towards the back of the bathroom. Nothing happens. It's silent. And then Patricia again says, "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after the second time that, Patricia is given this command, Béranger and Remy, they heard the sound of banging on a door upstairs on the third floor, basically right above them. And then they hear the sound of shuffling footsteps all over the place, and then the sounds of mournful crying, and there's more banging, and, and Béranger and Remy, they're holding each other. They're so scared. Patricia's unmoved. She's just standing there, anchored in the room, and all this commotion's happening upstairs. And then suddenly they hear the distinct sound of a door flying open, and then all these footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed in with the sound of crying, but it was not crying like sad. It was blissful crying. It was tears of joy as whoever was up there was charging down the hallway, down the steps, and out of the castle. At this point, it was like a calm fell over the whole castle. And Patricia, she turned away from, whatever else was inside of the bathroom, and she looked at Remy and Béranger, and she smiled, and she said, "It's over. It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia would tell them that she was able to actually channel the ghost that had been in the bathroom, that evil entity. And she said it was Jean, it was his ghost, and that he had been haunting their castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a sort of purgatory where he believed he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. And so every time somebody died inside of this castle over the many, many years that he had been here, he would take their spirit prisoner up in that room on the 3rd floor. Those were prisoners. But Patricia, during this exorcism, had said to him, "It's over. Like, the war is over. It's time to move on." And he understood that she was saying, the war is over. And at that point, Jean is the one who freed the prisoners on the 3rd floor. That was the sound of all the prisoners being released. They were all so happy, and they fled the castle. And then at that point, Jean himself, his spirit, was finally able to rest. However, there's one more wrinkle to this story, which is shortly after the exorcism, when life sort of returned to normal for all parties, Patricia and Béranger were speaking, and Patricia at some point just kind of offhandedly said something like, "It's a good thing, Béranger, that you texted me again and got me to come back out here, because clearly I was able to help you guys. I was able to, free these spirits from the castle. What a good thing it was that you texted me again." And Béranger said, "What do you mean?" And Patricia was like, when you texted me about how the castle was sort of calling me, you were right. Like, clearly it was. And I came over and we took care of it. But Béranger was like, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send that text message." And Patricia, she pulled out her phone and she showed her the text where it was like, "The castle is calling you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Béranger was like, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Béranger, and Remy still have no idea who sent that text to Patricia.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Tonight, I'm going to share one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you go camping with the follow button, wait until they're about to go to sleep, and then just go ahead and pour a ton of itching powder into their only sleeping bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon drove his work truck along a paved road in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is this huge nature preserve in southern Wyoming. Carl had taken off early from his job on an oil rig to go elk hunting in this preserve,
And now he was heading towards this very specific area in the national forest called McMarty Canyon that he had heard was really good for elk hunting. As Carl drove, he found himself looking around at the evergreen trees and the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and he just felt this total sense of calm come over him. He was a very rugged outdoorsman, and there was really nothing he loved more than spending time out in nature all alone. And so for a little while, he was just enjoying himself, driving along, until eventually the paved road he was on gave way to this long, rocky trail. And Carl, he didn't want to damage the truck he was driving, since it actually belonged to the company he worked for. So he wound up pulling over and getting out, and then he just grabbed all his stuff and continued walking on the trail by foot. The hike along this trail was not only, pretty rocky and rough, but it was also predominantly uphill. And so it didn't take long before Carl was having trouble breathing. And not just because it was physically taxing, but also because when he was younger, he had tuberculosis, which had left his lungs really riddled with scar tissue that did make it harder to breathe, especially when he was exerting himself. But, Carl continued on, and every few minutes he would just stop and bend over and catch his breath. But after about 30 minutes or so, he had hiked to the point where the trees had begun to thin out, and then he found himself standing inside what looked like a big bowl in the earth. So this was McMarty Canyon, where he was, intending to go for this elk hunt. And, the reason it sort of felt like a bowl is because it was mostly just flat with some shrubs and grass, a few trees, and these tall hills out on the sides, sort of giving this impression of a bowl. And so Carl, he sort of just stopped and took stock of the area. And wouldn't you know it, when he looked straight across the canyon, the bowl, he saw a group of just 5 elk grazing in the distance. Like, this was unbelievably lucky. Here they are, right away. And so Carl slowly began walking towards them, doing his best not to make any noise. And then when he was within shooting distance, he just stopped, raised his rifle, and he looked through his sights to aim at the first elk he saw, and then he pulled the trigger. But for some reason, when he pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off. It didn't fire, or at least it didn't appear to. And certainly there wasn't any kickback. It just was like nothing happened. But then he saw something that just didn't make any logical sense. And at the same time he's experiencing this just insane phenomenon, he felt this massive wave of vertigo, and then he just sort of felt himself falling, and then he blacked out. The next thing Carl knew, he felt himself being shaken back and forth. And he sort of slowly began to blink his eyes, feeling very confused and disoriented. His head was pounding, it was clearly dark outside. And then he realized, sort of with horror, that somehow he was back inside of his work truck, but the surroundings outside of the truck definitely looked different, like the truck was parked in a different spot than where he'd left it. He suddenly felt himself getting shaken again, and then he heard someone say his name. And he looked up, and in the darkness, he saw there were 2 men that he didn't recognize who were clearly shaking him, trying to get his attention. And they tried to ask him, what was going on? But Carl's mouth sort of felt numb. And when he tried to speak, it's like the words came out garbled and nonsensical. And so at some point, these 2 men sort of gave up trying to talk to Carl, and they just lifted him up, pulled him out of the truck, and they carried him over to their vehicle. And Carl heard them say something about a hospital, and then before long, their car was driving off, and then Carl blacked out again. About 30 minutes later, around midnight on October 26th, so this is 8 hours after Carl first blacked out, his wife Marjorie rushed into a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Wyoming. And inside, she saw Carl lying on the bed, hooked up to an IV, and there were a bunch of monitors with a nurse standing beside him. And she saw, her husband's eyes were open, but clearly unfocused. And then as Marjorie is just standing there, taking in the initial shock of what she's seeing, the nurse actually pointed at her, at Marjorie, and then asked Carl if he knew who she, his wife, who she was. But Carl, he turned and he looked at Marjorie, but he just kind of stared blankly and then shook his head and said no. So earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, waiting for Carl to come back from his hunting trip. But when he hadn't shown up on time, she ultimately had called the sheriff's department and asked them to go to McMarty Canyon just to check on him. And so 2 deputies had gone out there and they found him, and he was unconscious in his truck. So those 2 deputies were the ones who obviously shook him awake and took him to the hospital. But interestingly, beyond the fact that the deputies had no idea what happened to him,
They reported that his truck had been parked 3 miles away from the main road in this muddy bog, and strangely, there were no tire tracks leading to it. It was almost like it was just dropped in the bog with, Carl inside of it. But, despite this weirdness, the deputies, and Marjorie for that matter, were not concerned about, the weirdness around the truck. They were worried about Carl, who's just laying here unconscious. And so they had rushed him to the hospital, and Marjorie had driven there as fast as she could. A doctor had already explained to Marjorie that her husband was, clearly very disoriented and seemed to be suffering from a case of amnesia. He couldn't even remember his own name, let alone, what had happened to him while he was out in that canyon before the deputies showed up and found him passed out in his truck. Doctors had given Carl x-rays and brain scans and run all kinds of tests on him, but not only did they not find any evidence of some sort of head injury, that likely would have caused his amnesia, but they actually didn't find anything wrong with him at all. He seemed perfectly fine beyond him just showing up basically unconscious and disoriented. And so realistically, the staff told Marjorie that because they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. And so for now, Carl was just being kept in the hospital under constant observation. And so Marjorie just took a seat on the couch next to her husband's bed, sort of not even sure what to think of this whole situation. And she was about to ask the nurse a couple of questions, but then suddenly Carl sort of tensed up and began frantically looking around the room, like he really had something in mind that he was looking for. And then he began saying, where are my pills? Marjorie had no idea what pills her husband was talking about, and it was clear the nurse also didn't know what he was talking about. And so Marjorie, she reached out and just tried to grab her husband's hand to try to calm him down. But the moment she did that, Carl sort of stopped what he was doing, and he yanked his hand away and stared at her like she was a total stranger. 2 days later, Carl still could not remember what had happened to him when he had gone hunting. But he had recovered some basic memories, like his own name and also who his wife was. And so between that and the fact that realistically Carl did not have any signs of any physical injury, the hospital discharged him and just sent him home with Marjorie and basically told her that he was probably fine and that he probably just needed to be in a familiar place to sort of recover all of his memories and get back to normal. However, when the couple got back home, it very quickly became clear to Marjorie that Carl was not okay, and he was not getting better. For the most part, Carl was just unusually quiet at home, uncharacteristically quiet. And then when he would speak, it often was in that frantic sort of nonsensical way that he had spoken in the hospital when he was, looking for his pills. And in fact, when he was home, he did continue to suddenly start looking for his pills. And then also he began telling Marjorie that, somebody had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to ask him, what do you mean? What do you mean your pills? What do you mean somebody took your elk? What are you talking about? But Carl didn't even seem to know. He would have moments of recognizing that it's so crazy what he's saying, but he just didn't have the memories to be filled in. It was like Carl was just as confused by his own vague memories as his wife was. However, a few days after they got home from the hospital, Carl suddenly told his wife that he'd actually remembered something really specific about what had happened when he was hunting, a new memory had popped up in his mind. He told her that when he was in McMarty Canyon and he saw those elk and he raised his rifle and he pulled the trigger, he said there was no sound, there was no kickback, it was like nothing had happened. But then he said something happened that truly just didn't make logical sense. He said he realized the gun had fired, but it was like the world had slowed down and he could actually literally see the bullet leaving the rifle, but in slow motion. This bullet is trickling out of the gun and slowly making its way, across the canyon, and he's just staring at this bullet. And then the bullet seemed to strike an invisible wall of sorts, at which point the bullet actually stopped and almost flipped inside out and sort of flattened and then fell to the ground. And then also as the flattened inside out bullet fell to the ground, Carl said he too fell to the ground and he blacked out. Now, when Marjorie heard this, her first thought was this is nonsense.
this is not real. This is something maybe Carl's mind has created to fill in the gaps of his memory, because it's got to be really frustrating for him that he's got all these like fragments that he can't put together. And so maybe this is just his mind filling in the gaps with this really specific and weird imagery. But not long after hearing this story, Marjorie was doing the laundry and she was finally washing the clothes her husband had on when this whole thing happened out in the canyon. And when she reached into the pockets of his jacket to make sure they were empty before, washing the jacket, she felt something metallic. And she pulled out this round, like flat disc, this metal disc. And at first she just had no idea what it was. But then she thought about what her husband had said about the bullet from his rifle, flipping inside out and flattening and falling to the ground. She couldn't help but feel like this metallic disc that she's holding in her hand that was in her husband's jacket looks an awful lot like a bullet that has been flipped inside out and flattened. Like she couldn't believe it. Not long after this discovery of the alleged bullet, Marjorie sat next to her husband on a couch inside of an office at the University of Wisconsin. They were both sitting across from a psychology professor named Dr. Leo Sprinkle. Now, Marjorie knew this meeting was sort of a long shot, but she was hopeful that, maybe they would learn something valuable. So by this point, Carl had not recovered any other memories from his hunting trip. But after, recovering the supposed flattened bullet in her husband's jacket, Marjorie became convinced that something truly strange had happened to her husband. I mean, she obviously knew something happened out in the canyon, but now it just seemed like I don't even have any theories for what could have happened, but something really weird must have happened. And so she and Carl were both very determined to try to figure out what happened. And so that's how they ended up in Dr. Sprinkle's office. Dr. Sprinkle was not your average psychologist. He was a really big believer in hypnosis. He practiced hypnosis. And specifically, he believed that hypnosis could potentially allow people to access repressed memories, which is exactly what Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle, and Carl for that matter, believed was going on with Carl, that he had experienced something that was being repressed. But it was in there, you just need to find a way to access it. So, that day in the professor's office, Marjorie stayed very quiet and just observed while Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to close his eyes, to relax his head down towards his chest, and just focus on his breathing, in and out, in and out. And after several minutes of this, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head back up. And Carl did, but when he looked up, his eyes were actually still closed. And at this point, Dr. Sprinkle asked Carl to tell him what happened on October 25th when he went elk hunting in McMarty Canyon. And Carl, with his eyes still shut, began to speak really fluently. And he began telling just the most insane story Marjorie, or Dr. Sprinkle for that matter, had ever heard. Carl said, again under hypnosis here, that after he had watched that bullet leave his rifle in slow motion and hit this invisible wall and flip inside out and fall to the ground, he said that he too had fallen basically at the same speed as this bullet onto the ground, and basically he passed out. But he only blacked out for like a second. And when he opened his eyes, he said he was still lying on the grass in the middle of this canyon. Except now, standing over him was this tall, dark figure that was wearing almost like a very tight-fitting bodysuit, almost like what a scuba diver would wear. And Carl said this figure was vaguely, human-shaped, but it had very yellowish skin and very small eyes and no ears and no lips. And there were two antennas sticking out of, its forehead. And one of its arms extended into this flat stump, but the other arm seemed to have almost like a prosthetic attachment at the end of it that almost looked like a power drill. And then, in perfect English, this figure sort of looked down at Carl and just said, "How are you?" And Carl said he was so stunned by this thing speaking to him in perfect English that Carl just sort of blurted out, "Oh, pretty good, pretty good." And the figure seemed satisfied with this answer, and it went on to quickly explain that its name was Ozo 1, and it came from a planet 163,000 light years away from Earth. And it said it had no intention of hurting Carl. In fact, it said it wanted to help Carl. Then, with the hand that sort of resembled a power drill, it reached into what looked like a pocket on its bodysuit, and it pulled out this small packet containing 4 pills. And it told Carl that these pills would heal him. And then this thing offered Carl one of these pills. And Carl, for reasons he couldn't explain, just immediately took the pill and swallowed it. And then after that, Carl said that Also One asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl just said, sure. So Also One helped Carl off the ground. And then as soon as Carl was standing back up again, he saw there was this cube-shaped vehicle not far away. And a split second later, Carl said he was somehow inside of this vehicle, along with Also One, and also 2 other vaguely humanoid figures, and the 5 elk that he'd been out here hunting. They were behind this clear wall like a containment pen within the vehicle. And Carl was seated in a chair, as was Also One and the 2 other humanoids. They were all just sort of sitting there. Then Carl said he felt this powerful force push against his body, like the vehicle was moving so fast that it basically pushed him back into his seat. But less than a minute later, the vehicle just stopped, and Also One said, we're home. At this point, Carl was just suddenly standing outside of the vehicle. And he said it felt very cold, and the sky was jet black. And then around Carl, the landscape was very different from planet Earth. It was very rocky and desolate without any trees or grass or really any organic-looking life anywhere. And then in front of Carl, he said he saw this massive metallic-looking tower that sort of reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. And there was this light on the top of it that was actually so bright that Carl said when he looked at it, it sort of hurt his eyes. And so Also One led Carl, the 2 other humanoid figures, and the elk to a door on the outside of this tower. And once they were standing outside of it, Carl said the door slid open, but instead of it sort of leading into the tower, it just led to what reminded Carl of the inside of a large elevator. And the whole group just got on board and began riding up. And then when this elevator of sorts came to a stop and the door opened again, Carl saw this small room with metal walls and a handful of what looked like platforms on the floor. Also One led the elk onto one of those platforms and told Carl to get on one too. And so Carl just did as he was told and stood on one of these platforms. And then out of nowhere, some kind of high-tech device emerged from these metallic walls and began sort of circling around Carl. It went from his head all the way to his toes, basically like scanning him. Carl was vaguely aware of the same process taking place to the elk as well. And then when this scanner was done, it made a beeping sound, and then Also One looked over at Carl and told him, well, the elk are what we needed, but you're not. So we're going to take you back to Earth now. And then Carl said the next thing he knew, he was just magically back inside of his work truck, like he had somehow been transported there instantaneously, and he was being shaken awake by those 2 sheriff's deputies. And so back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Marjorie is listening, just completely shocked by what her husband is saying, not even sure what to make of it. And then Dr. Sprinkle, at the end of Carl's story, when he got to the point where he's being shaken awake by the deputies, Dr. Sprinkle snapped his finger, and Carl kind of came to. He opened his eyes and sort of refocused, clearly out of hypnosis. And then they all just kind of sat there, like in total silence, really unsure what to say to each other. But as crazy as Carl's story sounded, there were several very strange facts about Carl's case that, up to this point, nobody had been able to explain. And the story that Carl told while under hypnosis technically accounted for all of them. The first fact that this story explained was that when Carl woke up in his work truck, like magically just appeared in his work truck, it was not just 3 miles away from the main road, it was actually 3 miles away from where he had originally parked it. And this truck was just sitting in a muddy bog with no tire tracks leading up to it. So it was just totally unclear how it got there. And so if you follow along with Carl's story, perhaps when he was transported back to Earth, they, this other creature and the other humanoids maneuvered the truck with Carl in it into this bog. The second strange fact is that when Marjorie had ballistics experts analyze that flattened presumed bullet that she had found in Carl's jacket, they were just as baffled as she was. Like, they could not come up with any earthly explanation for how a bullet could be flattened and turned inside out. Like, this was not possible. And so again, if you follow Carl's story,
Perhaps this being is the one that flipped the bullet inside out. And the third and perhaps strangest fact is that when hospital doctors gave Carl x-rays, they found something that should have been medically impossible. All of the tuberculosis scar tissue in Carl's lungs that had plagued him for decades, that had made it so hard to be physical and exercise, they had somehow disappeared. It was as if someone or something had healed him. Despite how unbelievable Carl's story sounded, and despite the fact that hundreds of people have spent decades trying to disprove it, no one has ever found a better explanation for the moving truck, the impossible bullet, and Carl's disappearing scar tissue. Because of that, some researchers believe that Carl Higdon's account could be one of the most credible alien abduction stories ever recorded.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
So tonight, I have a great story to tell you. It sort of reminds me of when I was a kid. I used to go camping with my family once a year out in western Massachusetts, and we'd sit around a campfire just like this, and my parents would tell me and my sisters ghost stories. And it was sort of unclear how true the stories really were, but they were always terrifying. And this story that I'm going to share with you tonight is from Japan, and it happened about 50 years ago. And over the last 50 years, it's been shared many, many times, and there are many versions of the story, so it's sort of up to you to figure out how much you really believe is true here. But it is a genuinely frightening story. Also, according to some versions of the story, once you hear it, you only have 3 days left to live, unless you follow really specific instructions, which I'll give you at the end. But before we get into tonight's campfire story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and go to their movie cabinet where they keep all their VHS tapes and take all the covers off all the tapes and mix them all up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Late on a winter night in the 1970s, a middle-aged train driver named Takashi Ito, along with his assistant, were sitting in the front seat of a small cargo train that was hurtling along the tracks in Hokkaido, Japan. So this was just a 2-car train. There was a cargo train in back, and then there was the front train that, Takashi and his assistant were in. There were no passengers behind them, so it's just these two. And the area that they were driving through was this very desolate area. And basically outside, if they looked out their windshield, all they would have seen was just basically snow and ice and just pitch black darkness and the train's headlights pointing straight ahead. That would have been all they could see was whatever, was in the headlights. And as they were driving along, they had shut all the windows to the car that they were in, but it was so cold outside and the wind was whipping and they're driving right into the wind that some of the cold air was coming in one of the windows. And, it's freezing cold out there. It was starting to get really cold inside the cabin. And so, both men are starting to shiver. And so at some point, Takashi turns to his assistant and he just tells him to, hey, go ahead and open up the heating vent on the floor. So there was just this little vent that you could open up that would basically expose the engine to the main cabin, and so some heat would come up from the engine. But it would get really hot really quickly, and so you couldn't do it for very long, but it was getting pretty cold. So the situation called for it. And so Takashi sort of had one eye half focused out the windshield, sort of roughly following along with the direction they were going. And then the rest of his attention was just on his assistant, who was doing this mundane task of crouching down and sliding open this vent here. And at some point, the assistant managed to open up the heating box. And right as he did, something caught Takashi's eye outside of the train. Now, remember, it's the middle of the night, it's the dead of winter, there's really nothing out there. And even though, of course, it's Takashi's job to pay attention to what's out in front of them, there's no expectation he's going to see anything on the tracks at all until he gets to the next stop, which was quite a ways away. And so the fact that anything caught his attention was alarming, and he turns and he looks out the windshield and he can't believe what he sees right in the middle of the tracks. Just several dozen yards ahead of the speeding train is a woman. She's just standing in the middle of the tracks looking up at the train and doesn't even appear to be trying to move, but she clearly sees the train barreling down on her. She looks terrified, and Takashi and the assistant, they look at each other, they start trying to get the train to stop, but there's no way. The train's going way too fast, it's way too heavy, and so it's like they throw the brakes on, they're trying to stop, but there's nothing they can do, and this woman, she's just not moving. And then eventually the train smashes into her, and like Takashi and the assistant are like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And the train, it eventually comes to a grinding stop, several hundred yards away. And then finally, when it's actually stopped, it's like Takashi and the assistant, they know what's happened. They've just killed someone. I mean, it's clearly an accident, but like the shock of this was unbelievable. And so finally, Takashi, he looks at the assistant and he's like, we have to go out and see if she's okay. I mean, they both knew there was no chance. Like, there's no chance she's alive after being hit by the train. But out they go, and sort of apprehensively, they began walking in the snow towards the back of the train. Now, neither of them had a lighting source. They didn't have a flashlight or anything like that. And they're going towards the back of the train. So they don't have the advantage of the headlights shining where they need to go. All they have are the taillights of the train, which are now flashing red. And so as they're walking through the snow and the wind is whipping and it's pitch black out there, and of course these two men, they're in shock about what they've just seen. They can't believe, like, what was she doing out here? Like, what happened? They're walking and all they're seeing out in front of them is darkness and the occasional, flash of red light that sort of roughly illuminated the snow out beyond the train, and then back to darkness. And they know somewhere out there behind the train is this woman who almost certainly is dead. So it means that there's like a dead body out there. And so Takashi and the assistant, they start making their way back towards the back of the cargo train, and then they begin walking beyond where the train was, basically along the tracks they had just covered. And sure enough, up ahead, periodically illuminated by these red lights, was this, mound on the tracks. It looked very much like a body. And sure enough, as Takashi got closer, he realized it was the woman. And almost immediately, he could tell, one, she was definitely dead. And in some ways, he kind of hoped maybe, there was some miracle that she had survived somehow, maybe, but definitely confirmed that she's dead. And the second thing was he could sort of see what happened here. Her foot appeared to be wedged in the tracks. She must have been stuck in the tracks. And even though it looked like she wasn't trying to move, it might have been because she literally couldn't. And so she was trapped, and we hit her and we killed her. But that wasn't all. I mean, this scene was horrible. I mean, her body was destroyed. But more than that, part of her body was missing. All they saw on the tracks were actually just her legs. It was just her lower half, and she had these lace-up dance shoes that would have been very difficult to take off. The dance shoes sort of gave away that this was the woman. They look like feminine legs, feminine feet. But again, her upper half is just gone. And so Takashi and the assistant, they sort of look around in the general vicinity to see if, her upper half is nearby. And again, all they have is this periodic red flashing light across the snow, and it's dark, it's cold, the wind is whipping. And sure enough, just a little ways off the tracks, they see another sort of heap on the ground, and there's nothing else out here. So this has got to be the woman's upper body. And so they cross over the tracks, they leave behind the lower half, and they see there's like a trail of blood across the snow. And when they get to this second mound, it is this woman's upper body. But I mean, the scene, it would have been horrible for anyone to find this, but it was especially so because as they walked up to this woman's clearly, dead upper half, she was looking right at them. I mean, her arms were outstretched and her eyes were open, and her torso, it's positioned in such a way that she was almost like staring at them. And they walk up to her, and her face, Takashi would say that it was almost like she was looking at him with an accusatory look, like she was mad at him for not having stopped the train. Couldn't you see I was trapped on the train? Like, that's what Takashi's thinking. Like, this dead woman is mad at me. She looks like she's furious with me. And so, it was very hard, but they continued walking towards her to, just really confirm that she's definitely dead. This is not like a second person here, but no, it was clearly just the upper half of this woman, and she was definitely dead. And despite the very unsettling nature of the way her body was positioned, ultimately, Takashi and the assistant, just turned around and began walking back towards the train. Now, this is 1970s Japan. They don't have cell phones. In fact, they didn't even have radios. Like, they didn't have a good way to get in touch with anyone. They clearly knew they needed to tell authorities what happened here, but realistically, the only way to do that was to go to the train, and then one of them would have to basically walk to the nearest civilization and get help that way, while the other person stayed with the train and also with the woman. And so the two of them, they get back to the train, they get inside of that front car, inside of the enclosed warm space, and they shut the doors, and they sort of just look at each other like, okay, this is obviously horrible, but what are we gonna do? And Takashi, being the more senior of the two, said, well, look, I'll stay here with the train. You, the assistant, go out and get help. I'll be here when you come back. And so the assistant, as much as it was sort of daunting to have to walk off into the darkness and the freezing cold, it almost was like a relief to get away from this scene. I mean, this was truly horrific. And so, Takashi watched as the assistant bundled up in his jacket, and he headed out the side of the car door, and then off into the darkness he went. And then Takashi was left alone inside of the train with, this woman's body behind them on the tracks. And so shortly after the assistant had gone, Takashi, he's just sitting inside of this unmoving train car. And remember, they had that heating vent open, and even though the train was not moving, there was still quite a bit of heat that was coming up into the cabin. And so it was actually getting quite toasty inside of this train car. And Takashi is literally just not moving. He's just sitting there waiting, just trying not to let his mind wander to this horrible thing that's happened behind him. And he found himself actually feeling kind of tired. I mean, he had had a really long day. I mean, he'd been up for nearly 24 hours at this point. And so suddenly he was like, man, maybe I ought to just lay down and close my eyes for a minute, because obviously when they come back here, they'll wake me up, like no problem. And so Takashi did eventually get down on the ground right next to that vent, so he was really getting the maximum amount of heat. And he curled up and he closed his eyes. But pretty much immediately, once Takashi closed his eyes and effectively attempted to sleep, all he could see in his mind was that woman standing on the tracks looking up at him before she was struck by the train. And then he would try to, force himself not to think about that, telling himself it really was an accident. He could not have stopped the train. And also, they rounded a corner before they saw her. It wasn't like they could have seen her if they hadn't been fiddling around with the heating vent beforehand. They wouldn't have seen her. They had to turn that corner, and then they saw her. Like, there was no way to avoid this. This was an accident. But it's like he couldn't get that image of the woman out of his mind. And then if he managed not to think about her on the tracks, his mind would then jump to seeing her upper half positioned on the snow with her eyes still open, looking at him with this, in his mind, this sort of accusatory look on her face. And so he can't sleep.
But like he's so exhausted from the day and he's just so worn out, it's so traumatic that eventually after, 10 minutes or so, he did begin to feel himself sort of allowing himself to drift off to sleep. Like he did have these horrible thoughts, but he felt himself getting closer to finally being able to get a little bit of sleep. And right at that point, right as he's teetering on actually sleeping, he hears something outside. Now, remember, it's late at night, the wind is whipping, it's the middle of winter, and so there had been this ongoing ambiance of the howling wind and like nighttime winter sounds outside. There are animals out there. I mean, there's lots of noises going on here. But whatever the sound was, he just couldn't quite place it. It almost sounded like metallic, like something was scraping against something else, like maybe two pieces of metal were grinding together, like shk, shk. But he couldn't quite tell what it was, how far away it was, but it really stood out right away amongst all the other noises he was hearing. And so he's laying there on the ground and he's listening to the sound. He can't quite place how close or far away it is. For all he knows, it could be way off in the distance or it could be right in the cargo train behind him. And so as he hears this sound, which is sort of periodic, he tells himself like, oh, maybe it's my assistant. Maybe he's back with help. Maybe he found someone really quickly, because it's only been like 10 minutes since he left. But then he's thinking like, there's no way. Like, I know we're sort of in the middle of nowhere. We're in this really desolate part of Japan. Like, there's no way he would have just magically found help that quickly. So it can't be my assistant. Unless maybe he's turned around for some reason, but, why would he do that? And so he's sort of picturing like, what were the reasons that it could be the assistant? And as he's doing that, the sound is getting louder, and it's definitely getting closer. And the sound is, again, it's like a chk, chk, chk. It's like a grinding sort of like movement almost, like something's coming towards him. And he can tell now that the sound, whatever it is definitely near like the cargo train. Like it's right behind where he is. And the way he's laying, his head is towards the front of the train, so his feet are close to the door that led out into the open and then would eventually lead you to the cargo train behind. And so he's starting to get sort of apprehensive. Like, what is that? Is it like an animal? Like, could it be the wind? Is it like somehow whipping against the train in some way that it's making this strange sound? And all the while, this grinding sort of like rhythmic sound is getting louder and louder and sort of faster and faster. And then finally, as the sound is so loud that it's practically echoing inside of this room he's in, he hears the door to where he is slide open. And he turns and he looks to see what is coming into the train. And when he sees what it is, he starts to scream. About an hour later, Takashi's assistant, who had managed to go get help, was in the back seat of a police cruiser along with two police officers who were driving in the direction of this train. There was actually a road that kind of cut out into this sort of desolate area that overlooked the train tracks. And sure enough, they pulled into this sort of carve out on the road, and the assistant pointed, and there it was. There was the train sort of off in the distance, sort of walking distance from where the car was. And so the cops, they parked, and all three of them, they get out, and the police officers, they had flashlights. And so it was much easier to navigate the sort of barren terrain here. And they walked away from the car down to the train. Now, remember, obviously there has been a tragedy here. This woman was struck by the train. And of course, the police know this by this point, and the assistant knows that's what they're walking up to, the scene of this woman being killed. But there really wasn't anything, sort of darker than that. Like, this was a terrible accident. But it's sort of like, we just got to follow protocol now. We got to go down there, we got to figure out what happened and sort of, follow process, if you will. And so the three of them, they know what they're walking into, right? They're going to meet Takashi, he's waiting in the train, and they're going to take it from there. And so they're walking through the darkness, and they're shining their lights, and the assistant is behind the two police officers, and they're walking up to the train. And when they get close enough to the train, the assistant begins yelling out for Takashi to let him know, like, hey, we're here, we're here, like, come on out. But Takashi doesn't call back. He doesn't come out of the train. But again, this is not like hugely alarming. The assistant's like, okay, maybe he fell asleep inside of the train car. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they make their way over to the door that leads into the front car of the train, and they slide it open and they step inside. It's a very small space, and
Takashi's not in there. And there's no sign of anything bad that's happened. He's just not in here. And so the assistant's like, okay, that's weird. It's sort of odd that he didn't respond to us calling for him. He's not in here, but maybe he's in the cargo train, the second car for some reason. And so they leave the front train car and they go into the cargo train car, and Takashi's not in there either. And so at this point, the cops are looking at the assistant like, what's going on here? Like, where would Takashi be? It's the middle of the night. Like, it's just pure barren wasteland. It's ice and snow everywhere. Why would he leave? And so the assistant's like, maybe he left and he's with the body. Maybe he was just standing with the body or something. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they begin walking towards the back of the train and then begin following the tracks towards where, the lower half of this woman is, according to the assistant. And so down the tracks they go, and sure enough, eventually they see up ahead the legs that are sort of still stuck in the tracks. And as they're shining the light and they're calling out for Takashi, there's no answer, and Takashi is nowhere to be found. And so now the assistant's really getting worried. Like, it didn't make any sense. Where could he have gone? The only other place that made any sense was maybe over near the torso. But the assistant knows, like, of all places that at least he would want to be, it would not be near the upper half. I mean, that was so creepy. The way the body was positioned, the way it was staring at them. And he knew Takashi had been really unsettled by it. So why would he go over to that? But he told the cops, like, hey, shine the light sort of over there off the tracks, because the upper half of this woman, that's where she is. Maybe he's over there. And so they shine their lights in the direction of where the upper half was. And there's no Takashi. And there's no upper half. There is no torso. The woman's torso is gone. And where it was, very clearly, is this huge sort of like flattened section of snow with blood everywhere. And it's like this just horrible scene, but there's no upper body. So Takashi's gone, and this woman's body, her upper half anyways, is gone. And so now, like, the assistant and the officers, they really don't know what to make of this. But the first thought, at least from the assistant, was, maybe a bear came through and was, basically taking the woman's body to go eat it or something. And maybe Takashi was out here and maybe he got chased off by the bear, or worse, maybe he got attacked by the bear. And this sort of made sense. Like, oh my God, like, is there a bear nearby? Like, do we need to go in the train just to seek safety here? And so the police officers, they're sort of scanning their lights around, trying to see if maybe Takashi's nearby. And at some point they notice there's actually boot prints that leave where the torso had been. And they sort of took off into the night, sort of away from the train, sort of off into the distance. Now, there didn't appear to be any bear tracks around, but again, they're thinking that's what it could be, but they see these boot prints and they're like, we gotta go check. We gotta see if maybe these prints will lead us to Takashi. And so Takashi and the two officers, they begin following these tracks. And as they do, they see the prints, these boot prints, get farther and farther apart, like Takashi was running, like his stride was getting longer and longer, and there's blood everywhere, like this drag mark of blood all over the snow. And they follow these prints all the way past the train, way off into the night, where they finally stop in front of this huge utility pole. And at this point, they're looking around like, where's Takashi? Like, where did he go? Like, there's nothing down here. And then at some point, they hear something above them. And so the police officers, with their flashlights, they shine up towards the top of this utility pole, where at the top, there was this fairly large metal platform. And as they shine their lights up, they see Takashi. And he's draped over the edge of this platform, totally lifeless. His arms are dangling down, and he's got this horrible, huge wound across his stomach. He's bled all over. He's clearly deceased. And so they're shining their lights up at him, and like the shock of seeing Takashi is horrible. They back up. They're like, oh my God, is there a bear here? Did the bear somehow get up there with Takashi? Like, what's making that noise up there? And they're shining their lights, and at some point they hear a noise again. And then as their lights are aimed towards Takashi in this platform, this figure sort of emerges above Takashi, like it crawled over Takashi, and it peered down at the two cops and the assistant. And it was the woman's torso. It's like her upper half. She sort of looked down at them, blood's all over her, and she's sort of clutching on to Takashi.
And then in one move, she sort of thrust herself over his body and began pulling herself down the pole towards the men. And the men, they immediately start yelling and they turn and they start running. And as they're running off, all they can hear behind them is chick, 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 which is the sound of this woman dragging herself through the snow towards them. Unfortunately, the assistant did not make it. The woman caught up to him. But the two police officers, they were able to run back to their car. They got in and they sped off towards the station and they told people what was going on at this train. I mean, they couldn't even describe it really without it sounding totally made up. And so eventually, reinforcements head back to the train. And when they get there, they find the assistant. He clearly had been caught by this woman on his way to the car and he was destroyed. His stomach was ripped wide open. He was dead. But, the authorities, they searched everywhere and they couldn't find this woman. Her upper half was just gone. Her legs were still stuck in the tracks, but the murderous upper half of her was gone, and they never found her. Today, it's said that the animated top half of this woman's corpse still haunts the railroad tracks in Hokkaido. She's known as Tiki Tiki because that is the name that was given to sort of encapsulate the sound that she would make as she pulled herself through the snow. The sort of chik, chik sound became Tiki Tiki. Now, according to some versions of this story, after you've heard the legend of Tiki Tiki, like you have now, you only have 3 days before she shows up to get you. But it is possible to survive it. Before she slices you in half across your midsection, she'll pause to ask you one question. And if you answer this question correctly, she'll let you live. The question is, do you need your legs? And the only correct answer, spoken exactly like this, is yes, I need them right now.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Hey guys, welcome back to the official MrBallen Campfire. Tonight I have two awesome stories to tell you. They are both of the strange variety. In both stories, we're going to talk about a tragedy, but it is not the tragedy that is the reason we remember these things. We remember these events, or we still talk about these events, because in both stories, there are elements that just nobody can fully explain. There are truly unexplained phenomena that are fascinating, that are terrifying, and I know you're going to love it. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and replace all of their shoelaces with 20-foot-long shoelaces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. Just before 10 a.m. on November 14th, 1995, A 19-year-old man named Zhang ran down a dark street toward a bus stop on the outskirts of Beijing, which is the capital city of China. Zhang, who worked at a fast food restaurant, had gotten off work late. And so now he had to catch this bus because it was the last one out of the area, and if he missed it, he'd be stranded. So this area where Zhang worked was actually a pretty historic district in Beijing. It was home to several old palaces and shrines that were built at the foot of this mountain called Baiwang Mountain. And so this area was sort of like a popular tourist area. And so during the day, it was very busy. There was lots of cabs coming in and out of the area. But at night, it was basically deserted and no cabs came through here. So again, the bus really was his only shot of getting out here unless he wanted to walk on foot, and that was just not practical. And so Zhang continued running along until he turned the corner, and up ahead he saw the bus stop, and he didn't see the bus. It was just basically a deserted street, but standing near the bus stop was this old woman, and it appeared like she was waiting for the bus, which suggested to Zhang that he had not missed the final bus, because clearly she was waiting for it too, unless she also missed it perhaps, but it just seemed like she hadn't. And so Zhang, who by this point is like kind of out of breath, he stopped running and he walked the last distance up to the bus stop where this woman was. And as he approached her, she kind of turned and looked at him like, "Who are you? You know, it's late at night. She's all alone. You know, it's just kind of weird." But she looked at him and he kind of just smiled at her to signal like, "I'm no threat. You know, I'm just here for the bus too." And then before the two could even talk, Zhang heard the sound of a bus approaching. And he turned and here comes bus 375. It came to a stop. The old woman climbed on, and Zhang followed up right after her. A moment later, Zhang was inside the bus. The doors had closed behind him. The driver had taken off from the curb. Zhang had paid the ticket seller, who was separate from the driver, sitting in sort of the front right seat. And the woman who had been in front of him, she also had paid. She had sat down in the row right next to the ticket seller, right behind the driver. And Zhang, even though the whole bus was empty, nobody else is on here except for these three people, he just sat down right behind the old woman. So he takes his seat, you know, they're driving down the road and, you know, it's late at night, he's tired, he's had a long shift. And so for a little while, Zhang just looked out the window and watched all the, you know, imperial gardens and the shrines and all the various landmarks that drew people to the area. You know, this was again sort of a touristy area. He's just watching it all pass by. You know, it's late, it's dark, he can't see much out there. But eventually, you know, relatively soon after they had started, they passed by sort of all the touristy stuff and they entered into this stretch of road that Zhang was very familiar with. He took bus 375 home all the time. That, you know, this stretch was very desolate. There was no more buildings, no more anything. It was just kind of forest and wild on either side of the road. And so as a result, at night, driving this desolate stretch was very, very dark. There was just literally no lights. And so once they were in this sort of desolate stretch, Zhang found himself just kind of leaning back and closing his eyes because it was a little bit of a ride before he'd get to his stop and get off the bus. And so he just closed his eyes and he's trying to kind of nod off. And they're driving for a little while and he kind of felt himself beginning to fall asleep when suddenly he felt the bus start to slow down. Now, there was no indication within the bus that anything had happened. Zhang knew that it was way too early to be at the next bus stop. And so immediately he opened his eyes and he's just kind of looking around for some cue from the driver or the ticket seller or even this woman, like what was going on here. But then the bus came to a full stop and it's so dark outside that Zhang like literally can't see what's going on out there. And no one's saying anything. And the driver just kind of inexplicably gets up from his seat and he walks out of the bus, like he exits the bus, which was odd. Like there's no clear reason for this. And so Zhang, the woman, even the ticket seller, they're kind of just like peering out the window, out the front window of the bus to see what's going on. But given how dark it was outside and the fact that there was really only light inside the bus, it had the effect of just kind of making all the interior glass of the bus be sort of reflective, like really difficult to look out. Imagine sitting inside of a dark room with a light and being surrounded by glass. It'd be impossible to look out at. All you would see was like a mirror effect all around you. And so for a minute, Zhang and the others are just kind of like wondering what's happening. What did the driver see? And then Zhang heard something outside the bus that sounded like people talking, or maybe he thought it was people talking. And so he pressed his face up to the glass and put his hands up to it to see if he could cut through that sort of mirror effect to see what was going on out there. And at first it was just darkness. He couldn't see anything. But eventually his eyes adjusted, and on his side of the bus, on the road, the driver clearly was interacting with what looked like multiple people, like 2, maybe even 3 people that are down there. There didn't appear to be, any other vehicle. Like, it just wasn't clear what was happening, but there was definitely people outside of the bus. And so Zhang and the others, no one's talking. They're all just kind of trying to make sense of what's happening. And then before anybody could ask any questions, the driver comes back on the bus, sits down in the driver's seat, and then behind him come these 3 new people, who presumably were the same people the driver was speaking to outside the bus. They also are likely the reason the driver stopped in the first place, although again, it's very unclear why they stopped in the first place. Like, there's no reason to be stopping here, but Zhang at this point just wants to get home. He doesn't really care. But these 3 people, they come on board the bus, and immediately Zhang and the woman and the ticket seller, they're all looking at them like, what's going on here? So there were 3 men, and they were all wearing these traditional silk robes. There were 2 in blue, and there was 1 in red. And the 2 men in blue were like physically holding up the 3rd man in red, almost like he couldn't stand on his own. Like, picture somebody who was like really intoxicated. Like, he couldn't quite stand. But immediately Zhang clocked that this guy didn't look drunk or something. He looked hurt. Like, he was covered in mud and like grime, as if he had been like rolling around on the ground or something, or maybe he had fallen or whatever. Like, it wasn't clear, but something happened to this guy. And the 2 guys in blue, who their robes are pristine, they're holding this guy up, and they kind of bring him into the bus, and then without saying anything to these people on the bus, they just kind of dragged this man, who was conscious, but again, barely able to stand, down the aisle, past Zhang, past the others, to the back of the bus, where they took their seat. And then it was like nobody said anything. The driver didn't acknowledge how bizarre this whole thing was. He just pulled away and started driving. And then before long, it's like Zhang is just sitting there, really unclear, like, what's even happening. But as they're driving along, he just felt so uncomfortable. The woman right in front of him, she had gone, back to looking straight ahead. She's not paying attention to what's happening behind her. Same with the ticket seller. But Zhang, he just felt really uncomfortable. And specifically what he felt was, it just seemed like the 3 guys in the back, the silk robe guys, 1, they were completely silent, eerily silent. And 2, it just felt like Zhang, it was almost like he could feel them staring at him. Not just looking straight ahead towards the front of the bus, but it was like they were looking at him. It was like a primal sense that Zhang had. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became, and frankly, the more fearful he became. Like, it was like every little noise behind him was like confirmation that they were like looking at him, or maybe moving up the aisle to get closer to him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn around and look. It was like he was terrified of what he was going to see behind him. And so he just stayed glued to his seat, rigidly looking straight ahead. But again, it was like this whole ride, he's just like, they're staring at me, something is off, like, what's going on with these guys? And it went on and on for like 10, 15 minutes of just this really tense ride. But despite how sort of awful this ride had become, even though he couldn't fully articulate exactly why it was just so uncomfortable, despite all that, Zhang is thinking, any minute now, we're going to get to my stop, I'm going to get off the stupid bus, and this is going to be over and done with, and I'll forget all about this stuff. But before they reached his stop, while they're still in this sort of isolated part of the ride where it's very dark outside, Zhang, who again is just sort of glued, looking straight ahead, he notices the woman right in front of him, who this whole time has seemingly completely forgot about the guys behind her. Like, she's just looking straight ahead, no big deal. She just all of a sudden turns around and looks towards the back of the bus. Just one fluid motion. She just turned and looked. And Zhang, he's staring at the woman as she does this. And he watches as her face goes from, curious and just sort of normal to her eyes going wide. And she stands up and she just starts screaming and pointing towards the back of the bus. And then before Zhang can turn around himself, and he's still too scared to even look, he feels something smack into the side of his head. And so he's like disoriented. It hits him again and again. And he realizes it's the woman who's screaming at whatever's happening in the back of the bus. And she's hitting him over and over again with her purse. And she's yelling something. And Zhang's like, what is going on? He's realizing she's screaming, thief.
at Zhang. She's hitting him in the head, screaming thief. He's got no clue why. He doesn't know why she's yelling at whatever's happening in the back. And before long, the bus driver just stops the bus, and without even asking what's going on, he just looks at Zhang and just gestures, "Get off the bus." As if Zhang is like the central issue on this bus. Not the strange people we've picked up 20 minutes ago that no one has any explanation for. No explanation for why this woman is screaming about whatever they're doing back there. The bus driver has just decided that Zhang is the issue. And Zhang, at this point, does just want to get off the bus. He doesn't want to be here. And so without even looking at the back, he just got up, no questions asked, breezed past the woman who's still hitting him with her bag, and out the door he goes. He didn't care. He knew he had a long walk home, but anything was better than being in that bus. Now, once Zhang actually got off the bus, he realized he actually was not in as bad of a spot as he could have been. Like, he expected to get off and basically be in the middle of nowhere because he knew they were in this sort of isolated area. But when he got off, he realized they had sort of just came to the end of that isolated section. And so pretty nearby, he could see a neighborhood, which meant he actually was not that far away from his home. And so he's thinking, okay, I got a bit of a walk, but again, thank goodness I'm not on that bus. I don't even want to think about what's happening on that crazy bus. Like, thank goodness I'm just out of there. And so Zhang, he just starts walking towards his home and he's making his way when he hears something behind him. And he immediately stops because think about how traumatic whatever just happened was for him. He can't process what's happened. It's this totally crazy, inexplicable thing. He's on the side of the road now, like he's on edge. And so he hears something behind him and he just stops. And this time, unlike on the bus, he does turn around to see what's going on. And he turns and he sees he's not alone. Standing behind him on the sidewalk is the old woman. And she's staring right at him. And so Zhang, he's looking at her, and immediately he clocks that, like, something's different about her. On the bus, that expression she had on her face when she screamed at whatever was in the back of the bus and then began hitting him with her purse, that expression she had was like fear and paranoia and even anger. That's what he saw on her face. But now she's like smiling and she's looking at him with this almost like I'm sorry look on her face. Like please, I want to talk to you about what just happened. She was signaling to him like, we need to talk. And so picking up on that, Zhang, like he wanted to just go over to her and be like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that to me? I didn't take anything from you. Like he wanted to yell at her. But again, there was just that look on her face that said, like, I got to go talk to this woman. And so Zhang, he turns and he walks to this woman and he says to her, like, what happened on there? Like, what's going on? Like, what did you see? What happened? And she looked at him and she was like, I have to tell you a secret. So that night, unbeknownst to Zhang and very likely unbeknownst to this woman, this bus they were on, bus 375, after they got off, it would take off and drive off with its strange occupants on board. And believe it or not, the bus would vanish. It would just go missing. Nobody knew where it went. And then 3 days later, it was found crashed in a reservoir 60 miles north of where Zhang and this woman had gotten off. And on board the bus were 3 dead bodies. It was the driver, the ticket seller, and then also the man wearing red, the guy who was needing to be propped up by the other 2 men in blue. Now, authorities made no mention of the men in blue. It was just these 3 people were found on board the bus. Now, it was determined that all 3 of them had died from a broken neck. And so the running assumption was the crash itself caused them to break their necks, and that's what killed them. But there was a very strange determination about the condition of the bodies. So the occupants on board the bus presumably died within 72 hours, because that's the time frame they were missing and when they were found dead. But it was determined that their bodies were so decomposed, they likely had been dead for months. The secret that the old woman told Zhang was that when she turned around on the bus and she looked to the back and she saw the men, she said the men in blue were staring at Zhang with just a look of pure evil on their face. She was like, I knew it wasn't right. These were evil spirits, and they were after Zhang. It was like she instinctively just knew it. She didn't know why, she just knew it.
And almost like reflexively, she began screaming. And then it was like this thought crossed her mind that she needed to save Zhang. And the first thing she thought to do was accuse him of being a thief so the bus driver would stop and kick him off the bus. And so she put on this performance, hitting him, calling him a thief, basically to save him, to get him off the bus away from what she thought were literally evil spirits. And so think about this. She's telling Zhang this on the side of the road. They're in the middle of nowhere. Their ride is pulling away. Zhang wasn't like, oh boy, thank you so much for saving me from the evil spirits on the bus. He's like, okay, I get it now. I guess I appreciate it. And then the two of them just took off on their merry way. It wasn't until 3 days later that Zhang realized whatever caused her to have that reaction literally saved his life. And who knows who the men in blue were? Because something happened on that bus, something caused it to vanish and then crash into the reservoir, and everybody dies on board with their necks broken and their bodies decomposed more than they should be. Like, none of that makes any sense. But all Zhang knows is because of that woman, he was still alive. And so Zhang is like a mix between terrified that he was involved in this, but also so thankful that this woman saved his life. But what he did when he put it all together, when he found out about this bus and, what happened on board, the dead bodies and all that, he went to the authorities and he said there were 2 other people on the bus that were acting so weird, the men in blue, the ones the woman basically warned him about being these evil spirits. And he told the authorities. And, whether or not they bought the evil spirit line didn't really matter. What they're being told is there were 2 people acting strange on the bus before this all happened. And they went out and they looked for the 2 men in blue. And they never found them. No one has any idea who they were. And so to this day, all the locals all say to never take the last bus ride along Route 375. Afternoon in 1887, a man named Gene Wilson rode his horse next to the Platte River in Wyoming, herding some cattle that were grazing there. Next to him was Gene's dog, who was running along dutifully right behind him and sort of nipping at the cows' heels to keep them in line. So Gene was a ranch hand, and he worked for a ranch in the town of Casper, which was about maybe 10 miles away from where he was right now. And part of Gene's responsibilities was going out and finding lost cattle that wandered too far from the ranch and herding them back to the pasture. So on this particular day, the weather was perfect, it's sunny, it's beautiful, and generally Gene actually really enjoyed this aspect of his job. Like, he liked being out here. But today, even though he should have been like, this is a great day, he just felt really, really tired. He had worked many, many hours up until this point, and he really just wanted to be done and head back home to where he lived with his wife. They had this little house that was sort of tucked away in this secluded area in this valley surrounded by hills. It was like his oasis. Gene and his wife were like absolute best friends, like the very best part of his day, even on days where he went out and enjoyed his job. Still, the best part of his day was always returning home and just catching up with his wife over dinner. That was like the thing he looked forward to the most. And so right now it was like he craved just being home and being with his wife. He could not wait. But Gene, he was a diligent guy, and he just continued doing his job. He's trotting along the river, he's herding the cows. And at some point, as he's sort of at this point mindlessly doing his job, because again, he doesn't want to be here anymore, he looks down and he notices his dog is no longer next to him. His dog was always right next to him, helping, doing the herding, and his dog's not there. And so he stopped and he began looking around, and that's when he realized that maybe because he was becoming so mindless doing this job today, that this huge amount of mist had sort of rolled out over the Platte River. Like, he hadn't noticed that there was just all this mist. And as he's looking out, seeing this massive cloud of mist, he noticed his dog. And his dog was actually kind of going nuts. The dog had broken off and run to the edge of the Platte River, and it was sort of like barking like mad. And it had been for some time. It was like Gene just hadn't noticed it. And so he's seeing the mist and he's seeing his dog, and he's like, what's going on over here? He can't see anything on the river. This is a usually pretty well-traveled river, but there hadn't been any traffic, no boats or anything. And so it's a quiet day, but it's like he can't see anything out on the river. The dog is just going crazy. And so Gene's like, what's going on? What's out over there? And this is also like very unusual behavior for his dog. Like, his dog was very well trained. This is an odd thing for it to be doing. But, Gene's thinking there's got to be a good reason for it. The dog wouldn't do this for no reason. And so Gene, he lets the cattle just continue making their way along the river, but he, on his horse, he turns and begins making his way over to the dog, who again is sort of stationary by the river's edge, barking and looking out at something in the middle of this mist, presumably. However, as Gene trotted his way towards the dog, the horse began to react to something. Gene's horse began to react to something that Gene couldn't even see. It started to get really scared. It was whinnying and sort of unwilling to go any further. And then finally, when Gene really tried to get the horse to carry on here, the horse actually reared onto its back legs and almost kicked Gene off of it. Gene managed to hold on, and when the horse came back down on all fours, he just calmed the horse down and brought it over to a nearby tree. The whole time, the dog is still barking like crazy, looking at something out over the water. And so now Gene's like, what is going on here? He gets off his horse and he ties it to a tree, and then on foot, he walks over to his dog. And so he walks over to his dog's, yapping and barking, and as soon as Gene is next to his dog stops barking, but it continues to be really fixated on the water, which again is utterly covered by mist. He can't see anything out on the water. It's quiet, eerily quiet. The mist is almost obscuring the sunlight at this point. It's almost like they're inside of a cloud, and it's just him and his dog. The dog is fixated on something, and Gene's looking out over the water, and then all of a sudden it was like the mist began to part, and this enormous, way bigger than he had ever seen on the Platte River, this huge wooden ship suddenly comes into view. And so right away, Gene is sort of baffled by the ship. Number one, it seemed fairly obvious that this is the thing that his dog was barking at. And it might have been the same thing that the horse was reacting to, but Gene's like, why? There are ships that go up and down this river all the time. The dog, the horse, they don't react this way to any of those ships. What's that about? But more than that, this ship really was just enormous. Looked out of place. It was so big. And this is not a particularly deep river. And so Gene's like, how is this big of a ship here? And so Gene's almost fascinated with what he's looking at. He's sort of not really worried about the dog anymore, or the horse, or even his cattle. He's looking at the ship, wondering what in the heck it's doing here. Whose ship is this? And so Gene continues to watch as the ship, continues just slowly making its way down Platte River. And as he's staring at it, again, just sort of fascinated by it, he counts 9 sailors on the deck, moving around, doing something on the deck. But what they were doing on the deck just wasn't immediately clear. They weren't doing sort of obvious sailor things. They were clearly working on something in unison on the deck. There was something they were doing all together. There was this apparent huge tarp almost that sat in the middle of the deck of the ship, and they were sort of moving it around, and it appeared like there was something underneath it, but Gene couldn't see it, and he was too far away to make out what it could be. And so Gene is he's staring at this crew, he's looking at the ship, and then all of a sudden, all 9 of the sailors on board the ship, almost like in unison, just stopped what they were doing, and they turned, and they all, at the exact same time, just stared directly at Gene. And it sort of disarmed Gene. He was really, staring intently at them. It was alarming to have them all be looking at him all at once. And so he's sort of taken aback, and he's looking out at them are they looking at me? What did I do? What's going on here? And then all at once, these 9 people, they go back to what they're doing, and they begin to lift up this tarp, right? So they're revealing what's underneath it. And now, Gene, he's both terrified and sort of confused and still just fascinated. And he's looking out what are they going to reveal? This is so weird. And the tarp comes up. And at first, all Gene could see was this weird mound, a black mound sitting on the deck of the ship that was underneath this tarp. But as he continued to stare, he suddenly realized what he was looking at, it couldn't be possible. How could that be out? That doesn't make any sense to me. And he was horrified. He was scared, and he's thinking I don't even know what to do. And all of a sudden he grabs his dog, he runs back to his horse, and he thinks, I have to get home. I have to get home right now. And so on his horse he goes, he just gets his dog, he abandons the cattle. From what he's seen, he doesn't even care. He has to make sure that everything back home is okay. And he takes off. He starts galloping as fast as he can back in the direction of that quaint little home he's got down in the hillside. And so over an hour of riding, basically at full tilt, he finally crests the hill. And by this point, he's tried to convince himself that what he saw on board that ship could not have been a real thing. But he goes up the hill that looks down into the valley where he would normally first see his home. Except when he looked down into the valley, his home wasn't there anymore. His home was just this smoldering black ruin. The home had burned down, apparently in the last few hours while he was gone. And so Gene is a mixture of horrified, but also weirdly not surprised, and he blazes down the hill. He gets to what remains of his home. And he sees that's not all. He sees there is a black mound that looked just like the mound he saw on board that ship that is laying on the ground not far from where his house was. And it's the body of his wife. That's what he saw out on the ship. He saw the dead body of his wife burned and destroyed, but it was definitely her. He could make her out from here. It scared him so bad he went back to check, and now he's seeing it in real life. Now, of course, for all you folks who are hearing this story, you're going to think, come on, like this happened in the 1800s. Like how much of this is really true? What, he looked out and he saw a ghost ship appear with a premonition or a vision of his wife who he's going to find dead? Sure, right? Well, listen to this. So after Gene finds his dead wife, he has this incredible story about how he sort of knew about it beforehand by seeing this ghost ship, if you will. And so he went and told people. He told a lot of people about what happened. And eventually, a few years later, his story found its way to a journalist named Vincent Gaddis. And Vincent Gaddis happened to have done all this extensive reporting about the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is just off the coast of Bermuda. There's this section of the ocean where all this very strange activity has been reported over many, many years, like stuff that is basically paranormal in nature consistently is reported in this part of the world. And so he had done a lot of research on the Bermuda Triangle. And so he's primed to hear stories like Gene's story and take them seriously. And so when he heard about Gene's story, he began looking into it. And Vincent pretty much immediately discovered that there was absolutely no record of this enormous ship being on the Platte River. In fact, as Vincent found, it would have been impossible for a ship of that size, as Gene described, this 100-foot ship, being able to travel on the Platte River. It was too shallow. So there was no record, and it seemed impossible. And so the way Vincent responded to this is, okay, well, clearly, Gene is a man who's been racked by guilt and shame. He feels probably like he somehow let his wife down by going out that day, and she winds up dying in this fire. And so this is a man who's just dealing with grief. And it's his grief that has somehow created this story in his mind to explain what happened to his wife. It seems crazy, but people do crazy things when they are really deeply affected by grief. However, many years later, that same journalist wound up finding out that actually Gene was not the only person who had a story like this. He discovered that apparently 25 years before Gene's story and then 16 years after Gene's story, there were these two other people who specifically reported seeing this enormous ship on the Platte River that apparently had the dead body of one of their loved ones on board, and like all the sailors are looking out at them and they're like showing them this dead body, but that person that they're seeing was alive as far as these people thought. But then when they went home, they discovered that their loved ones were in fact dead. It was the same as Gene's story. In the years since these sightings, this ship has become known as the Death Ship, and it's widely considered to be a death omen, both in the Platte River Valley and also throughout Wyoming.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locascio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locascio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.